Welcome, friend. You've arrived at a story that may take its time, but it will stay with you long after it ends. Tonight, we begin a quiet journey through silence, not the absence of sound, but the kind that holds meaning in every glance, every pause, every breath. You'll meet a girl born into a world that rarely listened to what couldn't be heard, but she carried something else, something deeper than a voice. This is a story about strength that doesn't shout, hope that waits, and the long road one child took to be understood. Her name is Elowen Grace, and though she was never able to speak in the usual sense, what she offered the world was far from silent. Let yourself settle in. Breathe slowly. The story is beginning. The day Elowen was born, the sky over Glenhaven was dusted with soft winter light. A faint powdery blue, framed by bare sycamore trees. Her mother, Marianne, remembered the light before anything else. How it filtered through the maternity ward window and fell across the white cotton blanket wrapped around her newborn daughter. What she didn't hear, though, was the thing that clung to her memory most of all. No cry, no sound. The nurses moved quickly, checking vitals, whispering updates. But there was no panic, no sirens of worry, just silence. That strange, ringing quietness that seems to stretch time thin. Elowen's eyes blinked open, wide, alert, peaceful. She was alive, but something was different. The diagnosis came months later: congenital vocal cord paralysis. She would likely never speak. And so it was that Elowen began her life in a kind of in-between space. She could hear, she could feel, she could see, and later she would understand. But she could not answer with words, could not laugh out loud, could not say "Mama" when she needed comfort. Her silence was not a choice, but a fact stitched into every day that followed. Her parents loved her fiercely. They learned to sign, slowly at first. Marianne with the ease of someone who'd always been expressive with her hands, and her father, Robert, with the clumsy stubbornness of a man who fixed engines better than he read people. But both of them tried, and in those early years, love made up for what language lacked. Still, the world beyond their front door was less forgiving. At daycare, other toddlers didn't understand why Elowen didn't answer. Some laughed, some stared, some ignored her. Teachers tried to help, but their patience had limits. And when Elowen tried to join in, with a gesture, a look, a tiny drawing, she was often a few moments too late. The game had already moved on. By the time she was 6, Elowen had developed a quiet rhythm of watching. She watched the way people stood when they were nervous, how their fingers tapped when they were bored. She could tell when someone was about to interrupt, or when someone wanted to cry but didn't. She noticed things that others didn't see, simply because she had to. But being observant didn't mean being included. The loneliness began to settle like dust, slowly, invisibly, and everywhere. And unlike dust, it didn't wipe off with a cloth. It stayed. There was one place, though, where Elowen didn't feel outside of things. It was a little park behind the library, just a path, a bench, and a few wind-chiming trees. The wind spoke in gentle rustles, and birds chirped freely, not needing permission. There, she would draw in a small notebook, sketching what she saw or what she felt. Sometimes faces, sometimes shapes, sometimes just swirling patterns that looked like how her chest felt when she longed to say something but couldn't. One afternoon, an elderly woman sat beside her on the bench. She wore a forest green coat and had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You draw what can't be said, don't you?" the woman asked softly, not expecting an answer. Elowen turned, surprised. She didn't know this woman. The woman smiled. "I used to be a school counselor. You remind me of a girl I once knew. Quiet, but loud in all the best ways." She pulled a pen from her coat pocket and offered it to Elowen. "Keep writing, keep drawing. Even silence has a language." It was a small encounter, just a passing breeze in the long seasons of Elowen's childhood. But she never forgot it. As the years passed, Elowen's drawings turned into painted expressions. Watercolors at first, then charcoals, then digital illustrations. Each picture told a feeling: hope, confusion, anger, wonder. Her hands became her voice, her art, her language. But still, in school halls and crowded cafeterias, Elowen was often left behind. Group projects ignored her. Even teachers sometimes forgot to ask what she thought. She'd raise her hand in her own way, but by the time the room settled, the topic had moved on. There was a winter, her first year of high school, when she almost stopped drawing altogether. A boy had laughed at a portrait she'd submitted for the art club, said it looked like a mistake, crying. It shouldn't have mattered. But it did. That night, Elowen tore the drawing in half and didn't pick up a pencil for 6 weeks. But something odd happened during that silence. She began writing instead. Not words on paper, because she didn't trust them yet, but little lines in the margins of books, tiny symbols beside her favorite pages. A star when something made her heart lift. A wave when it made her feel understood. She kept a journal where each entry was a mix of symbols and sketches. It was messy, but it was hers. And slowly, she realized, there were many ways to speak, many ways to be understood. One spring afternoon, she was sitting alone at the library, when a younger student tapped her shoulder. The girl was in the grade below, with glasses too big for her face and a hesitant voice. I saw your painting in the hallway, she whispered. It made me feel like someone else gets it. Like when your chest feels all tangled, but you can't tell anyone why. Elowen stared at her. Then, without thinking, she opened her sketchbook and flipped to a page of swirling blue and gold, an image she hadn't shown anyone yet. The girl looked at it, her eyes filled. Elowen smiled, a small, crooked thing, and the other girl smiled back. No words passed between them, but everything was said. And maybe that's when it clicked. Maybe being heard had never been about sound at all. Maybe her silence held a kind of space, a place where others could step inside, feel less alone, and be met with something that asked nothing in return. It wasn't easy. The world still rushed. People still talked over her. There were still days when being voiceless felt like being invisible. But Elowen no longer tried to change the silence. She began to shape it. And you know, sometimes, just hearing a story like this reminds us we're not alone. And if this moment resonates with you, feel free to leave a like or subscribe to Quiet Strength. There are always more stories waiting here for you. Elowen's journey was far from over, but for the first time, she had begun to trust that her voice, whatever form it took, mattered, and that was a beginning. Elowen's second year of high school began the way most of her Septembers did. Soft rain misting against her window in the morning, the smell of cinnamon oatmeal drifting from the kitchen, and the familiar ache in her chest that surfaced every time she imagined walking through the school doors again. She no longer feared the silence. She'd grown used to it, but what weighed heavier was being misunderstood. There was something exhausting about having to explain your silence in a world that didn't wait for it. Teachers tried to accommodate her, but many simply gave her worksheets instead of inviting her into discussions. Classmates meant well, some even learned a few signs, but their patience wore thin when the pace of conversation picked up. People often assumed that just because Elowen didn't speak, she didn't want to, or worse, that she had nothing to say. In truth, her inner world was vast. She thought in colors, memories, half-formed questions. When others debated Shakespeare or trigonometry, Elowen often imagined scenes. Juliet not as a girl in love, but as someone screaming silently from a balcony. Triangles not as formulas, but as frozen sails on a quiet sea. But few knew this. So, she carried it all. Her thoughts, her metaphors, her unspoken laughter, inside. Until Ms. Audrey came along. Ms. Audrey taught literature, and on the first day of class, she did something no teacher had done before. She walked to the board, introduced herself with a smile, and then wrote, "Every voice matters, even the ones you don't hear. Then she signed it again with her hands. Slowly. Clearly. Elowen blinked. It wasn't perfect ASL. It was clumsy. A few signs were reversed. But it was effort. It was intention. It was acknowledgement. After class, Ms. Audrey handed Elowen a laminated card with a short message typed on it. Would you feel comfortable contributing in writing or drawing instead of speaking? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Something small cracked open in Elowen. She nodded. From that day on, every time the class had discussions, Ms. Audrey made space for a special board, a bulletin by the window where students could post sticky notes with quiet reflections. And Elowen's became a kind of highlight. One day, her note read, "What if Hamlet's madness wasn't madness at all, but a kind of grieving only silence could carry?" Ms. Audrey underlined it in red and wrote, "Brilliant," then showed it to the class. And for the first time, Elowen's silence became something others leaned into, not around. That winter, the school announced an art and writing showcase. Submissions could include anything: short stories, digital, paintings, poems, even installations. Elowen hesitated at first. She had ideas, so many, but the thought of exposing them made her stomach clench. The year before, her submission had been ignored entirely. But this time, something urged her forward. She didn't just want to draw. She wanted to say something. So she began working after school, locking herself in her room with soft music and quiet light. Over weeks, she created a multimedia piece called The Sound Between Us. It was part painting, part sculpture, a canvas of soft grays and blues, layered with textures, ripples, brushstrokes, shards of mirror. Beside it, a recorded slideshow of images paired with her written reflections. No narration, just captions, just images. And at the end, a single sentence in white against a black background. "Even if you never hear me, I am here." She submitted it with trembling fingers. The night of the showcase arrived in early March. Parents, teachers, and students flooded the school auditorium. The walls were lined with colorful student work, bright poems, bold abstracts, humorous comics. Elowen stood near the back, her hands stuffed in the pockets of her coat. She didn't expect much. But slowly, people gathered around her piece. They read the captions. They watched the video. Some paused. Some turned to each other, whispering. A few walked away with their faces strangely quiet. And then, something happened. A woman, middle-aged, wearing a navy coat and holding a folded program, stepped up beside her. She didn't know Elowen, but she looked at the girl with soft eyes and said, "This made me think of my son. He's nonverbal too. I've never felt him so close before. Thank you." Elowen nodded, throat tight. She didn't need to say anything. The woman understood. Later that night, as she helped clean up with Ms. Audrey and a few others, one of the janitors, a tall, wiry man named Mr. Callum, who rarely spoke more than 3 words at a time, paused beside her and said, "That piece, you did, it hit me. My sister, she used to draw like that." Then he added, "Keep going." It was the kind of encouragement that lingered long after the lights were turned off. But life wasn't always warm and encouraging. Spring brought its own shadow. At her annual checkup with a speech specialist, the doctor confirmed what they'd suspected for years. There was no significant change in her vocal function. Technology was improving, yes, but for now, and maybe for always, Elowen's voice would remain silent. The news wasn't surprising, but that didn't make it easy. Back in her room that night, Elowen stared at her reflection. Not at her face, but at her throat. At the hollow, just below her jawline where a voice might have been. She placed her fingers there, gently, pressed. Nothing. Not even a whisper. A wave of grief rose, familiar, unwelcome, and quiet as ever. She wanted to scream, just once, to feel what it was like to let something out with sound, to yell into a pillow, to laugh and hear it echo, to call someone's name and watch them turn, not because they saw her, but because they heard her, but she couldn't. And so, that night, she cried. Not loudly, not in great gasps, but with quiet tears, like rain falling on a rooftop you only notice when the world is still. In the morning, though, something changed. She sat at her desk, opened a new page in her sketchbook, and began to draw. Not sadness, not silence, but hands. Dozens of hands, signing, waving, reaching, helping, and then a single set of hands, her own, pressing into clay, shaping something. By evening, she had a new idea. Not to be heard, but to teach others how to hear what's often missed. She began planning an after-school club. Visual voice, a space for students who communicated differently, through art, gesture, sign, music, photography. Anyone who ever felt their way of expressing didn't fit the usual mold. She wrote a proposal. Ms. Audrey helped refine it. And by summer's end, the school approved a trial run. They met once a week. 5 students at first, then 8, then 15. Elowen led through visuals, slide decks, and written guides. She shared her process, how she used shape to reflect emotion, how colors replaced tone, how a single still image could say more than a paragraph. The group was quiet, but it was alive. One boy with a stutter brought in his stop-motion animations. A girl who had selective mutism shared her collage journals. They all began to understand that there were dozens of ways to speak. And in leading them, Elowen felt something. New blooming, not just strength, but purpose. A quiet purpose. One that didn't need fixing. Just listening. And so, Elowen's world widened. Not in the way she had once dreamed. Not with the sudden return of a voice or a miracle diagnosis. But with connection. With stillness. With recognition. Her silence was still there. But now it was full. And waiting for the next whisper of meaning to arrive. By the time Elowen turned 17, the Visual Voice Club had grown beyond anything she had expected. It had begun in a quiet classroom with a projector and a handful of students unsure of what they were doing there. But now, it had its own corner in the student newsletter. They had monthly showcases. The art room walls bloomed with their work. Photography series about family, watercolor stories without captions, even silent film clips played on loop in the media lab. What had started as Elowen's quiet experiment had become a kind of sanctuary, not just for the students who joined, but for the teachers and parents who stumbled across their work and paused, uncertain why they felt so moved. It wasn't about brilliance. It wasn't even about talent. It was about honesty. And Elowen, without ever raising her voice, had become its center. But being at the center of something brings a strange weight. One Thursday afternoon, just before winter break, Ms. Audrey handed Elowen a printed email from the Regional Arts Foundation. The subject line read, Youth Spotlight Nomination, Elowen Grace. She had been nominated for a community award, Emerging Voices in the Arts, a short video segment, an interview, a small grant to continue her work if she won. Elowen stared at the page. There it was again, that word, voice. She read the email 5 times, and something inside her twisted. She was honored, of course she was, but part of her recoiled. The idea of being interviewed, of standing in front of a camera, of needing to represent something, felt foreign. She didn't mind creating. She didn't even mind being seen. But she wasn't sure she could bear the performance of being understood. Because the truth was, some days, she still felt small. Still felt like the girl at daycare, watching a world she couldn't quite enter. Just because she had built something meaningful, didn't mean she'd stopped struggling. That night, she sat on her bedroom floor with her journal open. The pages were filled with sketches, ideas, reminders. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what to draw. What did it mean to be a voice when you didn't have one? She wrote the question down, then circled it. Then, carefully, she wrote beneath it, maybe a voice is just a way of being known. and there are many ways to be known. She sent in the acceptance form. The interview was scheduled for early January. A local videographer named Thomas came to the school with a small crew. He was soft-spoken and thoughtful. Before setting up the lights, he asked Elowen a single question on paper. "How would you like us to approach this? You can speak, sign, write. We'll shape the film around you." It was the first time someone had offered her control of the narrative rather than trying to translate her into something else. Elowen nodded slowly, then pointed to her sketchbook. She spent the next few days preparing, not rehearsing lines, but gathering images, selecting pieces of artwork, writing short captions that would accompany each scene. And at the end she added a single frame, just black with white handwriting. Some stories aren't told aloud, but they are still stories. When the segment aired on the Foundation's social media, it quietly caught fire. Thousands of views, hundreds of comments. People wrote about their children, their siblings, their students. People shared how they had felt invisible for years. One woman, a musician who had lost her hearing in her 40s, wrote, "I didn't know how much I needed this, and yet Elowen didn't feel like she had arrived. She wasn't chasing fame. She wasn't trying to be anyone's symbol. But for the first time, she felt something she hadn't expected. Belonging. Not because she had changed, but because she had remained. Still, not all attention was gentle. With visibility came comments that made her stomach turn. She's being used for pity. There are more talented kids out there. This is just art with a sob story." She tried not to read them, but she did. One night, after scrolling too long, she threw her phone across the bed and curled up beneath her blanket. The self-doubt came fast, sharp, whispering old lies. Maybe they're right. Maybe none of this is real. Maybe you're only being seen because you're different, not because you're good. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, she skipped the club meeting. She didn't respond to messages. She avoided the art room. It took Ms. Audrey coming to find her in the library, gently, as always. They sat in silence for a while. Then Ms. Audrey wrote a note on a napkin and passed it to her. "You don't owe anyone perfection. You're not here to prove your pain. You're here to live." Elowen traced the words with her finger. Something steadied. Later that afternoon, she returned to the art room. The lights were off. The room was quiet. But on the wall, someone had left a drawing. It was of a tree, tall, weathered, reaching. And in the trunk, someone had carved, "We grow toward the light, even if we start in shadow." There was no name, just a sticky note. "Thank you for making space for us." Elowen stood there for a long time, hand resting on the drawing. And just like that, the weight lifted. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to begin again. Spring arrived, and with it, her final year of high school. Elowen poured herself into her portfolio. Not for awards, not for applause, but for clarity. She began exploring new mediums, clay sculpture, kinetic installations, pieces that moved slightly when light shifted. She built a rotating column that used mirrored slats to reflect the viewer, back at themselves in unexpected ways. She called it, "Interpret Me Gently." The local university's fine arts program took notice. She was offered a partial scholarship, along with a mentor who specialized in visual storytelling and accessibility in the arts. It felt surreal. She stood in her backyard the night the acceptance letter arrived. The trees were still bare, but buds had begun to form. The air was cool, almost warm. Her mother came out quietly, stood beside her, and took her hand. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. It had been a long journey, and it wasn't over. But Elowen had found her rhythm. She had learned to hold silence not as a burden, but as a canvas. A place to shape something lasting. Something real. And the most remarkable part? Others had begun to listen. Elowen's first autumn at university arrived wrapped in gold. The campus, nestled in the edge of a quiet town, shimmered with turning leaves, crimson, amber, ochre. Squirrels darted between benches. Bicycles clicked along cobblestone paths. And the air held that particular stillness that made her feel, just for a moment, as if the world was holding its breath. But beauty didn't make transition easier. The first weeks were hard in the way loneliness often is. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a slow ache. She was surrounded by thousands of voices, and yet the space around her felt untouched. Her dorm roommate was polite but distant. Professors tried to remember her accommodations but forgot things. Captioning requests, printed notes, deadlines. Group assignments were chaos. People spoke fast, changed plans without writing them down, forgot to loop her in, and in the dining hall people sat in clusters, laughing and loud. Elowen often found a quiet corner by the window, a bowl of soup, a sketch pad. She didn't feel sorry for herself, but she did feel invisible again. It surprised her. After years of quiet victories, recognition, and growth, she thought she'd shed that feeling. But here, everything reset. The world didn't care about her past. She was just a new name in a new place. One evening, as she left her media arts seminar, she lingered behind in the darkening lecture hall. The room emptied quickly, too quickly. She'd missed a change in the schedule. The class project had been reassigned, groups shuffled. She hadn't been paired with anyone. Again, she walked back to her dorm slowly. The wind had picked up. Leaves tumbled across the stone walkway like forgotten thoughts. That night, she didn't draw. She simply lay in bed, staring at the glow in the dark. Stars she'd stuck on the ceiling her first week there, thinking maybe she didn't belong after all. But the thing about perseverance is that it often hides in the smallest acts. The next morning, Elowen got up early. Not because she felt strong, but because she couldn't bear the weight of doing nothing. She walked to the library, pulled out a book on kinetic sculpture, and began planning a personal piece. If the university didn't make space for her, she would carve out her own. 3 weeks later, her piece, Room for Quiet, was displayed in a tucked-away gallery on the 3rd floor of the arts building. It wasn't flashy. A small turning installation made of paper and thin wood, with layers of translucent panels. As it rotated, the shapes aligned to reveal the outline of an ear. Not a literal ear, but something more abstract. Soft, curved, receptive. At its base, a sign. To listen is to enter someone else's silence without needing to fill it. She didn't expect anyone to notice. But one afternoon, as she was adjusting the display, someone stood beside her. A tall student, wearing a dark green sweater and headphones slung around his neck. He looked at the sculpture for a while before signing slowly. "Did you make this?" Elowen nodded. He paused, then added, "It made me stop." He reached into his coat and pulled out a notebook. In it, he scribbled, "My name's Mason. I'm not deaf, but I have auditory processing disorder. I read lips most of the time. That piece, it felt like someone made it for people like me." Elowen blinked, then wrote, "That's exactly who it's for." They stood there, not speaking aloud, but something passed between them. Familiarity, not as in, "We've met before," but as in, "I understand this shape in you." Over the next few weeks, Mason became a steady presence. They weren't close immediately, but quietly, naturally, they began sharing space. They would meet in the art building lounge and sketch together, share recommendations for books and music. Mason introduced her to a tool that translated sounds into visual waves. She used it to build a new project, Songs for the Eyes. He showed her how he color-coded audio to remember class notes. She shared how she mapped emotions into visual textures. One afternoon, after a long study session, he signed slowly. "It's weird, isn't it? How people think silence means absence." Elowen thought for a moment, then replied, "Sometimes, silence is presence, just not the kind they're used to." That night, she walked home with a smile on her face she didn't realize she'd been missing. Not everything was fixed. Professors still forgot things. Events still had no captions. Some days, she still felt exhausted by the weight of explaining herself over and over again. But now, she wasn't alone. And more than that, she had someone beside her who didn't require translation. That winter, her department invited students to pitch solo projects for an open-ended exhibit. The theme was bridges. Elowen submitted a proposal for a multi-sensory experience, something that didn't rely on language or sound at all. A walkthrough, space where light, texture, movement, and pacing became the story. It was called Bridge of Breath. The exhibit would include soft fabrics suspended in motion, floor panels that lit up gently as people walked, and walls that pulsed faintly in time with human steps. At the center, a silent video looped, people sitting in stillness, listening. With their eyes, her proposal was accepted. She worked for weeks, cutting, soldering, sewing, composing without words. Mason helped wire the lighting. Others began volunteering. Even students outside the arts program showed up to help. When the exhibit opened in late March, the response was immediate and emotional. People walked through in hushed wonder. Some cried. Some simply lingered in the final room, standing in silence with hands over their chests. A note at the exit read, "This is not a performance. This is a presence. Thank you for meeting it." Faculty members praised the innovation. Local press picked it up, and Elowen, who had once struggled just to be noticed in class, was now quietly reshaping how people thought about expression itself. But to her, the most meaningful moment came when she found a small envelope pinned to the feedback wall. Inside, a folded card with shaky handwriting. "My daughter doesn't speak either. We came today." She walked through this and smiled. She looked up at me and signed, "This feels like home." Thank you for giving her that. Elowen held the card to her chest for a long time, and in that stillness, something inside her settled. A quiet knowing. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something. Wordless maybe, but deeply felt. A place where others could breathe. A bridge where no one had to shout to be heard. That night, back in her dorm, she pulled out a blank page and wrote just one line. The most powerful voice is the one that makes others feel they have one too. And then, for the first time in months, she allowed herself to rest. Not because the work was done, but because she knew now. Her silence had never been empty. It had always been full. It just took time and trust for others to hear it. By the time Elowen entered her final year of university, her name was being whispered in places she never imagined. Not in spotlighted headlines or viral fame, but in quiet conversations among educators, in accessibility design forums, and among students who felt unseen. Her senior thesis had been requested by 3 arts programs abroad. A nonprofit that supported alternative communication systems reached out for a collaborative exhibit. Even a local school district invited her to speak. To speak, they'd said, not knowing the irony, at an inclusivity conference. She politely declined the speaking role, but offered an immersive presentation instead. A silent gallery of student voices in many forms. Collage, dance, coded light, sculpture, gesture. The presentation ran on loop for 2 days, and teachers left in tears. Elowen should have felt proud. She did, in part. But with the recognition came a ripple of unease. Everyone seemed to expect something from her now. More projects, more leadership, more explanation, as if her silence had become their canvas. And they wanted to paint meaning onto it. She had always fought to be seen. But now, she sometimes wished for the comfort of being unknown again. It wasn't just external pressure. Internally, she felt a shift. A question she couldn't shake. Who was she becoming beyond her work? Her identity had been built around quiet advocacy, expression without sound, leading without volume. But what happened when the world wanted her to be louder? She began to lose sleep. Not from stress exactly, but from a strange, restless guilt. She felt like she was letting people down simply by saying no. saying no to another showcase, no to a student documentary, no to the 5th podcast invite that week. She was tired, and it scared her. Because for someone like Elowen, who had fought so long to carve out her voice, the fear of becoming inaudible again felt unbearable. One night, Mason noticed. They were sitting on the grass near the sculpture garden, watching the lights flicker behind the library windows. He nudged her arm gently, then signed, "You've been quiet." She smiled faintly, then signed back, "I'm always quiet." He looked at her, a little too long, then wrote something on his phone and handed it to her. "Not this kind of quiet. The kind that shuts you down instead of opening you up." She looked away. He waited. Eventually, she typed, "I feel like I'm disappearing again, but this time, in front of people." Mason didn't answer right away. Then he took off his headphones and wrote, "Maybe you don't need to be everything, for everyone. Maybe just being here is enough." She nodded, slowly, and let herself breathe. A few days later, she made a decision that surprised even her professors. She withdrew from one of her senior showcases. Not out of failure, but preservation. She wrote a letter to the department. "I am deeply grateful for the support I've received, but I'm learning that even in silence, I must make space to rest. Creativity and compassion are not infinite wells. They need stillness to stay alive. I hope you understand." She turned in her final project instead as a quiet submission. A small installation titled Intermission. It was a room with a chair, just a chair. And on the walls, handwritten messages from those who had struggled to keep going. There was no music, no lights, just stillness. And at the end, a sign that read, "Sometimes rest is the most radical form of strength." The piece was understated, but students lingered in that room more than any other exhibit. Some left notes behind. Others sat and cried. Elowen visited once, anonymously. She watched a girl fold herself into the chair, close her eyes, and exhale, in a way that felt like surrender. And in that moment, Elowen felt something unexpected. Relief. She didn't need to perform strength to embody it. Graduation came slowly. One week melted into the next. Final portfolios, goodbye dinners, signed yearbooks. Elowen didn't walk in the formal ceremony. She requested her diploma by mail, not because she wasn't proud, but because she wanted to leave gently. She packed her things quietly. The dorm room, once unfamiliar, now held echoes of everything she'd learned. She took down her art, peeled off her glow-in-the-dark stars, folded up a hoodie Mason had lent her and forgotten. Before leaving campus, she visited the studio one last time. There, she found a white envelope on the floor, slipped under the door. Inside, a letter, written in neat cursive. "I never spoke to you in class. I was too shy. But your presence made a space for me I didn't know I needed. I used to think silence meant being alone. You taught me it can mean safety. Thank you." No signature. Elowen smiled, folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, then walked outside, into the soft light of early summer. She moved back home for a while. Not because she had no plans, but because she wanted to begin again without rushing. She taught part-time at a local arts center, ran small workshops for children with communication challenges, drew quietly in the afternoons. Sometimes she'd take long walks through Glenhaven, back to the park behind the library. The bench was still there. So were the trees, rustling in, the wind like soft conversation. One evening, as she sat sketching the changing light, a boy walked up to her, maybe 6 years old with messy curls and wide, curious eyes. He didn't speak, just watched her draw. Then slowly reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. A drawing. Just scribbles, really. Swirls and loops in blue crayon. He held it out to her. Elowen accepted it gently, then turned her sketch pad to show him her own scribbled patterns. Much older, more precise, but full of the same movement. He smiled. Didn't say a word, but she understood. And in that moment, everything made sense again. Not as a grand victory, but as a quiet circle. One child, long ago, had been born without a voice. But she had found one. And now, she was helping others find theirs. Not by giving them words, but by showing them how to listen inward, to the places where voices begin. Years passed like turning pages, quietly, steadily. Elowen never chased after recognition, but it came anyway. She didn't tour the world, didn't give keynote speeches or become a viral sensation. Instead, she built slowly, like she always had, with patience, with honesty, with care. She co-founded a small arts organization called Rooted Light, a space for those who expressed in non-traditional ways, not just for the nonverbal, but for anyone whose stories had trouble fitting inside sound. Trauma survivors, neurodivergent creators, immigrants learning new alphabets, aging voices growing fainter with time. The studio was quiet most days. Just the soft hum of pencil on paper, brushes in water, fingers dancing across fabric, light glinting off glass. But the walls were alive with color. Workshops filled. Community members came. Children laughed. Not loudly, but deeply. Teenagers stayed after hours, not because they had to, but because it felt like somewhere they didn't have to explain themselves. Elowen taught one session a week, a class called Story Without Sound. She never introduced herself as an inspiration. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. One rainy afternoon, she received a letter. It was written by someone she hadn't heard from in over a decade, Ms. Audrey. The envelope was thick. Inside was a note. Elowen, I kept the very first drawing you ever gave me. A swirl of blue and gold. You signed it with a star. I've since watched you become what you always were. A bridge, a quiet force. I'm retiring this year. But I wanted you to know that you've been my greatest lesson. Tears came quickly. Not the heavy kind. The warm kind. The kind that rises not from sadness, but from the fullness of being seen. Elowen placed the letter beside her notebook, then turned to the window. Outside, rain dripped gently down the glass. Everything was still, and inside her, everything felt whole. Her hair turned silver slowly. She wore it long, loosely pinned. Lines appeared around her eyes, not from strain, but from softness. She still didn't speak, and never needed to. Because, by then, dozens of former students had gone on to teach in their own ways. A girl who used movement to tell stories became a dance therapist. A boy who once stitched his feelings into fabric now ran textile workshops for refugees. An elderly painter with Parkinson's found new purpose finger painting beside children who had no words at all. They didn't all credit Elowen. Some may not even remember her name, but she had made space, and in that space, things grew. She visited the library bench sometimes, still carried the little boy's crayon drawing from years ago in her wallet, still wore the bracelet her mother had signed "I love you" onto in tiny embroidered beads, still believed the quietest lives often echo the longest. One autumn, a reporter from a local paper came to visit Rooted Light. He asked the usual questions: how it started, what it aimed to do, where the funding came from. Then he asked something more unexpected. If you could go back to that day, the day you were born, and change it, give yourself a voice, would you? Elowen thought for a long while. Then she took out a notepad and wrote, "No, because I was never voiceless. I just spoke in a way the world hadn't learned to hear yet." He didn't ask anything after that, just nodded, and sat in the silence with her for a while. One evening, long after the last class ended, Elowen stayed late in the studio. The lights were low. The room smelled of paint and clay and paper dust. She stood before a large canvas. It wasn't a commissioned piece, not a gallery work, just something she'd begun for herself. She dipped her brush into pale gold, added a single curve, then stepped back. It wasn't finished. But then again, neither was she. Not because there was more to achieve, but because the act of continuing, in itself, was enough. She smiled. Small, soft. And the room felt full. Elowen Grace's story isn't one of dramatic breakthroughs or loud triumphs. It's a story of quiet endurance, of growing inch by inch into one's own rhythm, of reshaping silence into sanctuary, of learning that a life can be meaningful even when it doesn't follow the arc others expect. Elowen never regained her voice in the traditional sense, but she never needed to. She discovered, over time, that communication is not defined by sound, but by connection. That listening can be an act of love. That stillness can carry more power than noise. Her life reminds us that not all strength is visible. Not all progress is fast. And not all victories are public. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep showing up, with gentleness, with persistence, with hope. Because somewhere, someone is watching. Not to be impressed, but to feel less alone. And maybe, just maybe, your quiet example will be the bridge they've been waiting for. So if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or misunderstood, remember this: your story still matters, even in silence, especially in silence.